The hooded blanket is back. There is a dog asleep in my bed. And if I still believed in signs, technically, my grandmother does, then the universe just told me that maybe this isn't a video that I should be creating. I say this because I don't have a tripod. I record on my phone. And seconds ago, all of the books that I used to stand you on plummeted to the ground. Then, when I set my phone to record, that too fell to the ground. Gravity is trying to tell me something here. But I finished reading the books that I have to read for the BookTube prize. And despite saying that I was going to read the Women's Prize long list with a good friend of mine, Charlie Brooke, formerly of BookTube fame, now just a supportive outlier. Despite that, I'm still planning on reading this next book. And I wanted to document that journey. I want to do this because people have been treating this book like a mammoth task. And I bought it last week, and I have to know what all the fuss is about. So, without knowing much about this book, I am planning on reading The Books of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk. Personally, it's in the house colours here. We know that usually Charlie can be seen in some shade of blue or red. My blue bookshelf, well, it was never actually supposed to be a blue bookshelf. I just own that many blue books that there is now an entire shelf dedicated to that colour. Do I know anything about this? I only know what KD Books put in his video, which was enough to intrigue me. I know of the conflama and the discussions that were had about this book in the realms of Instagram and YouTube and that world that I'm not really part of. I've been told not to go looking and trying to examine every single page because the beauty will come through. I mean, like, honestly, I read Dickens, he's a soap opera. Books of Jacob might just be some sort of drama. You know, I've read The Eighth Life by Nino Harachvili. This is apparently more dense than that, which, let's read the blurb. And I'll read it aloud, because we don't do that often, but we want to make sure we get this right. In the mid-18th century, as new ideas begin to sweep the continent, a young Jew of mysterious origins arrives in a village in Poland. Before long, he has changed not only his name but his persona, visited by what seem to be ecstatic experiences. Jacob Frank casts a charismatic spell that attracts an increasingly fervent following. In the decade to come, Frank will traverse the Habsburg and Ottoman empires, throngs of his disciples in his thrall as he reinvents himself again and again, converts to Islam and then Catholicism, is pilloried as a heretic and revered as the Messiah, and wreaks havoc on the conventional order. Jewish and Christian alike, with scandalous rumours of his sect's secret rituals and the spread of his increasingly iconoclastic beliefs. Oh. Okay. Well, let's put it aside for 1 second. This interests me. Well, clearly it interests me. I paid 20 quid for this book. It's bloody heavy, and if nothing else, if I ever decide that I'm going to build my own home, that's going to be one of the bloody bricks in the place. But, I've mentioned it before, about 60 years ago, basically, my family brought spiritualism to the town they moved to. Indeed, one of my great aunties, my grandmother's auntie, was the spiritualist minister for that town. I have the letters from the 1950s in which my very meek and mild-mannered auntie was accused of being a Satanist because she had been given the opportunity to write in the religious column of the local newspaper. This church was a big part of my family's life for decades, from the 40s until the 90s at least. Indeed, they were still religious, just dying off. So the idea of this person bringing these new ideas to a town, and, well, just travelling really with these new ideas, I find rather intriguing. Also, from the tone on the back, it reminds me something of like a quest novel, which you'd ordinarily see in fantasy fiction, or my favourite book. Well, I keep calling it my favourite book. I don't know why I did that. Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. I've never called it my favourite book before. I've called it a favourite book. But apparently we've thrown that out the window here. So, okay, Charlie, let's have these revelations on a Wednesday morning with too much caffeine. So, it's won an award, winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, winner of an English Pen Award. Shall we see what the Nobel Committee said? Olga Tokarczuk is inspired by maps and a perspective from above, which tends to make her microcosmos a mirror of macrocosmos. She constructs her novels in a tension between cultural opposites, nature versus culture, reason versus madness, male versus female, home versus alienation. Her magnum opus so far is the historical novel The Books of Jacob, portraying the 18th century mystic and sect leader Jacob Frank. The work also gives us a remarkably rich panorama of an almost neglected character in European history. Also thinking The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. Basically, I'm just throwing out there any of the long books I've read to get me through this, but basically, usually a book of this size I would read over a month, but with everything else that I've got want to read, I don't really have a month. So I've decided that I'm going to read some today, because this is a day that I have off work. I could have started it yesterday, but I was finishing Booktube prize books in preparation. I'm off work tomorrow, but I do have the writers group, and then I'm back in work, and my manager is off, so I'll be starting overtime next week as well, which means I will only have 2 days off next week as well. But most people who are reading this book only work more than me, so, and they've managed to get it done. So we have about 40,000 pages worth of contents page. 10 minutes in and we haven't even got to the book yet. You can tell we're putting it off, can't you? Prologue. Once swallowed, the piece of paper lodges in her esophagus near her heart. Good for her. Don't know who she is, don't know what's happening there, but good for her. They've used the word esophagus, and that's a favourite word of mine. Can't say why, because I first discovered it in a Take a Break. I first discovered that word in a Take a Break article about 12 years ago, when someone accidentally drank something corrosive and burned away their esophagus. Right, we've introduced ourselves to this book now. We're going to do this. We're going to be okay. We're just intimidated by the size. I can't say that's the first time I've said that. The dog has decided that despite being fussed all morning and being sat with me all morning whilst I read, that she had to be here for this portion of the video. I don't know whether she recognises that it's Thursday and I'm about to disappear to the writers group, where I'm likely to be gone for at least 5 hours because our founder's husband is releasing a book today, his first novel, and so I'm going to be there for the launch. I don't know whether that's why she has chosen that she has to be here for the video, but you can just, there you go, she popped her head up just in time to emphasise that there is a dog here. So, okay, hi, hello, this is that, right, okay, we'll just have to put a... This is difficult to do with a dog. I have now read 105 pages of the Books of Jacob. I'm going to put it down because there is a dog here. I feel bad because I had this idea that this was going to be some really dense text that was a bit difficult to get through, and the most difficult thing I found so far has been the size of the font. I found that with the last Fitzcarraldo book that I read as well. The font seems quite small for these old eyes, but it's also the font that they used in the Karamazov Brothers by Fyodor Dostoevsky in the Oxford World Classics edition. And I must say that I find myself reminded of the Karamazov Brothers by Fyodor Dostoevsky, or any piece of Victorian literature that happens to be rather dense. Yes. So the more that I read this book, the more that I think, if you have read any form of Victorian literature, perhaps a Dickens or a Trollope, maybe even George Eliot — I haven't yet got to Middlemarch, but I feel like that's a very intensive reading experience — then I feel like you can accomplish the books of Jacob, or Jacob, as was the debate that seems pretty constant at the moment. Also, having read some rather dense fantasy fiction in my time, I've done 4 books of the Stormlight Archive by Sanderson, read George R.R. Martin, got through Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderling series. These are books that include terms for things that we do not know, and they often discuss quests and go rather in depth and get allegorical. I feel like I can handle this book because of them. And I know that I mentioned this yesterday, but it's not felt like a challenge. Each chapter has seen the introduction of new characters, and they aren't really following the same characters in each chapter. Whilst the story hasn't yet got going 105 pages in, it does feel like what you would get in a novel like this. You know, it's a huge tome, and if we look at the structure of other books and then try and apply it to this, then it's really not reached the point where any sort of inciting incident has happened yet, as would happen normally in relation to shorter fiction. I'm liking it. I have a bit of a dark humour, as has been evidenced recently. So when the latest narrator was talking about their father boxing their ears because they had a stammer, immediately I started thinking about Mary Poppins. In terms of narrative style as well, I do find myself thinking back a lot to having read the Karamazov Brothers last year, which I buddy read with Emily of the Novelle Novels. And that was a book where I found myself getting confused by characters and trying to remember who was who. And also it was a book that veered off at times to go and discuss things that were seemingly inconsequential to the novel. And then I think of Anna Karenina, that I read about 8 years ago, and I do mean to reread. That has a lot of scenes that go off on tangents, and I have this idea that if you can contend with any of those things, then when it comes to this book, you're going to be able to cope. All that seems to have happened is a discussion on theology and the religious opinions of the time, and descriptions of various villages throughout Eastern Europe. And I have to say that I am enjoying the way that Tokarczuk is writing. The writing seems much more descriptive than I had expected, having read Drive Your Plough Over the Bones of the Dead. That felt a bit like a philosophical version of a Miss Marple novel. You don't have to worry about the journey you're being taken on because you're in the hands of a skilled writer. And so if you just move along and go with the flow of things, then you're going to get a lot more out of the experience, I think. And yeah, it's a bit of a slower reading experience, but it's only slower because of the amount of words on the page. I am not finding it this huge slog that I thought I would. I'm not finding it as difficult to get into as I had anticipated. So I think that's a good thing, and I'd originally set out thinking that I would read about 100 pages a day, and well, technically I've done that. I had hoped to maybe finish part 2 today, which is another 150, but as I do have to go out to the writers group, I'm not sure whether I'm going to achieve that, but the book is here. This morning I discovered it has been longlisted for the International Booker Prize, and so we'll see how I feel about it. But so far, we're only 105 pages in. It does everything that I like to see in a story, which is tales within it, tales, and the story of the inner workings of family are discussed here, and also the community, and also the religious community, and the way that these people view one another. It's almost as though Tokarczuk is showing how the wider world of the time worked, but also doing that through focusing on the community. And you are getting to see the beginnings of change and evolution within these communities. I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes. I recorded a half-hour-long wool gathering video, and then remembered I never actually updated on what I read yesterday. So got home, and after getting tea prepared and all this stuff, I didn't sit down to read until 8:30, and I kept reading until I went to bed at 11, and I still only managed to get 70 pages of this read yesterday. It's definitely not a page a minute type reading experience here. Also, whenever the font goes into italics, well, I do have difficulty. I've basically got the book up here then, look, trying to decipher the letters. Last night's reading, I really was reminded of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. Not in terms of fantastical fiction, but in terms of the way the story is told. In those books, you will have the usual narrative, and then you'll veer off for a flashback or a interlude, and all of these composite pieces come together in the end and jigsaw to create the overall narrative, and I do feel like that's what's happening here. So although sometimes I am feeling confusion, I'm very much trusting the process, trusting Tokarczuk that we're going to get somewhere in the end. It's a non-linear storyline, but I'm liking that. Also, the changes in font are so far helping to document which character is speaking at which point. I keep hearing about this wedding that has supposedly happened, but I've not seen anything yet. And these scenes where we're getting all metaphysical with Yenti so far are my favourite parts. You know, the weird, fantastical stuff is probably gonna be the bit that I like the most. But otherwise, I can't help but keep drawing parallels in my reading experience of almost a blend of The Eighth Life by Nino Haritsvili and The Brothers Karamazov last year. I can't help it. I feel like I've done the necessary preparation for this book. So whilst it's a slower reading experience, I'm enjoying it, and the only difficulty I seem to have is the place names and the names of folk in general. But the information that you need is all in there, and it has some great discussions, even only 200 or so pages in. It's Sunday, and today I have been catching up on reading this book, this extremely heavy tome that has started to make my wrists ache by holding it. So I'm aware that I'm probably going to have to break the spine on it. I hate breaking the spines on books, cracking the spines, whatever you want to call it. I don't want to be doing it, but I'm going to have to. I've sat with it most of the day laid out on the table in front of me, because as I say, too hefty, too old. And I'm aware this doesn't really give you a description of what the book's like, but how to describe it. So I am now 300 pages in. I'm hoping to reach book 4 today, which will mean that I have 475 pages left. It's still as dense and confusing as the Karamazov brothers was last year by Dostoevsky. Something similar to the Karamazov brothers and even Anthony Trollope, of which I thought there were some allusions to here, is the discussion of religion and Jacob wanting to, or Jacob, however we want to say it, wanting to start this new religion and all of the controversy surrounding that and the way that it is affecting people and making them, and the discussions that it is causing. In part 3 or book 3, I am finding there is a lot less of the somewhat flowery language that appeared in books 1 and 2, and that I appreciated. It was there in the first chapter of book 3, but it hasn't been so present. There does seem to have been this tone where it seems more episodic and more of a quest to get us through a bit speedily, but I don't know whether this is just as an introduction into what this third book is going to be about. It's a lot like a quest. With the last one, I found myself getting reminded of Hercules and Aeolus with the relationship between Jacob and Naaman. I don't really know that there's a lot to talk about. Tokarczuk can write, and the more that I read, the more that I am in awe at the quality of the prose. Sometimes there is humour within the prose, which I think is necessary, and I appreciate it. I appreciate the way in which it's written. I liked those brief flowery passages that were there. I like the fact that it has different modes of writing in order to tell its tale. I do get a bit bogged down sometimes when there is a more dry passage which is being used to move the story on, and yet I am enjoying a novel that for the most part is about religion. Jacob as a bit of a messiah complex, which I find fascinating to read about. He is a character who I would hate to know. I cannot support his actions in the slightest, however little we know of them. It's very intriguing to read about how people followed him and his charisma, uniqueness, nerve and talent that have so helped him to achieve the position he has achieved, although the world isn't shining so brightly on him at the moment, and certain people don't think he is as great as others do. Still intrigued, still looking forward to see where it goes, and today will be the day that we crack the spine on it. But hey, 300 pages in, just 600 to go. Just 600 to go. So yesterday, I did exactly what I said I would do and spent as much of the day as possible reading. So I actually managed to get through, I think, 200 pages of the books of Jacob. I now have 495 pages left of this book, and I have to say that getting past the 500 mark, having fewer than 500 pages to read, does feel like a bit of a weight has lifted. Somehow books underneath 500 pages seem like less of an imposition. It did hurt my wrists. I ended up having to crack the spine like I said I would and laying the book flat, which is something I completely dislike having to do, but the pain in my wrists from having to hold this tome has not yet diminished, so don't get old and don't get arthritis. That's all I can say. What we're getting at the moment is the persecution faced by the protagonist and his followers. We haven't really got to see much of Jacob in this book, and to me it then ends up seeming quite reminiscent of the Gospels within the Bible, where they are narrated by different people throughout and we're hearing what they have viewed, and that's what we get at certain times within this book. And I appreciate that Tokarczuk has done this, has used these different voices to continue to tell this story, different forms, in order to show us what the common man was thinking, what was going on between the upper classes. There's certainly a lot about the class structure of the time, and the way that that operates, and also the anti-Semitism of the time and the way that is operated, and finding out a lot of stuff about Eastern Europe at the time in which this book is set that I had no idea of before. And once again, as with Hilary Mantel last year, it brings into my mind these questions of strong historical fiction making... It's one of those books that kind of merges the line between historical fact and historical fiction, and I'm here for that. I am rather impressed by the author with this one. It feels like a brilliant book on every page. It's not, as I've said, there are dry moments and I don't ignore those, but the amount of poetic, beautiful prose that is in the novel offsets that. So looking forward to getting to read some of that as the week goes on. Not sure when I'll finish it due to the days I'm in work this week, but we will see. You're balanced on a boot again. So it's Friday. Yes, it's Friday, which means that it's been a few days since I last updated you, because I've been doing some reading of the books that have made it to the long list of the Women's Prize, which will be in another vlog. So I haven't really been reading much of the books of Jacob. It was also because I was doing overtime at work, so I decided to go with something less focused, well, not less focused, where I could focus my mind less. So yesterday, Thursday, I did some catching up of the books of Jacob, and this time round I actually went and I read what it said on the back. And reading what the Nobel people had said about the books of Jacob, I began to wonder whether this was somewhat similar to the Luminaries as well. And now I have in my head the recipe for this book, which is Brothers Karamazov, the Luminaries, that other book I mentioned earlier, and the Bible. I do think that if you've read any classic literature, this one will be okay, but at this point, trying not to spoil anything, I'm reminded of Wolf Hall in terms of the historical aspects of it and the way that we're getting these tales told to us and how we'll flit in and out of other people's lives, who are all in some way building up this whole jigsaw puzzle of the actual history. And if we add to that the mild bits of confusion I sometimes feel, then it does fit with the whole thing of being similar to Wolf Hall. I am rather enjoying it. I do think that it can be confusing at times, trying to recall which character is which. But I'm not mad at it. I don't mind going at a slower pace with this longer book. I think I have something like 425 pages left or something. I'm enjoying the journey with this one, and it is weird as heck and probably doesn't really go very in-depth into the characters' lives. I'd say that we're definitely observers as to what's happening, as opposed to what you'd probably get in some other literature, which is where you know every single character's likes and dislikes. They're not present so far. All we know that Jacob has a thing for having sex with his followers, and that supposedly breast milk is going to become a thing as we go on, but it ain't there yet. Indeed, I did wonder whether I was reading some sort of censored version, because half of the wacky stuff that people have been talking about I haven't come across yet. Anyway, I might read some more of it before I next see you. Well, no, I'll definitely read some more before I next see you, but I just don't know when that'll be.
I don't usually come to work in this shirt, but there was something this morning where I was like, no, it might be the shop this isn't a shop. This is a shirt I just get about the house in. But today is a shirt I'm wearing to work, and it might be oversized and it might be completely unflattering. But that's what we've chosen for today. In fact, to be fair, when have I ever wanted to be flattered before? Anyway, so it's been a while since I updated this vlog to do with my reading of The Books of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk, translated by Jennifer Croft. And we now only have 300 and something pages left. I do sometimes feel like this is a novel where the author has done a ton of research and perhaps not known what to cut. However, it would be interesting to hear the author discuss this book, and also to hear the translator discuss how they went about translating it. This is a book that can feel exceedingly tedious at times, because you'll get told an event is going to happen, and there'll be all this build up to this flaming event. And then when the event finally gets here, it is something of nothing and completely overshadowed. And perhaps that is what Tokarczuk wanted. She didn't want a novel that was necessarily going to be telling the story of Jacob Frank and all these people, his followers, his disciples perhaps, and more a novel showing the people of the time how religion and religious persecution affected people throughout the ages, and perhaps inspired some of their decisions, how some decisions are less to do with the religious aspect of what is going on within their lives, and more to do again with what they need from life, and how being a member of a different religion, although it might go against their ideology completely, could actually prove more beneficial to them as people, and thus religion takes a back seat in favour of human necessity. We still have some very brilliant passages in terms of prose, and the letters that we're seeing between certain members of the clergy and higher ups in society can be rather entertaining indeed. In fact, I just read a portion where someone decided that they were going to write an absolute barrage of lies about Jacob, and I found that quite hilarious. The descriptions within there fit that overall tone of someone trying to slander a name, but do it in a way that they could only do it by word of mouth. So they've written this down. So I suppose that's not word of mouth, but they could only use words to tackle Jacob, and they've just written things that are quite obviously lies, but would be very believable at the time due to the way people did believe things. So I found that somewhat humorous. And I think that the author, sometimes within the prose, it feels like the author is having fun. And I suppose that's also a credit to the translator, because the translator has managed to get that sense of fun and frivolity across through the prose. And I don't mean that this book is exceptionally humorous. I mean, there are just these moments that will appear, and they can be very short vignettes that seem rather bouncy and seem that they've been injected into the tale to emphasize a sense of humor about this situation, and recognizing the actual absurdity of everything that is going on. It's a particularly dense book, we know that. Oftentimes I feel as though I don't have much of a connection to the characters, which is strange when it comes to fiction for me. I can't necessarily, I feel anything towards the characters, but I think that if you broaden the scope of the novel and you look at it in those sorts of terms as what Tokarczuk is doing here, then, sorry, Cumberbatch Cumberbatch construction has just reversed into my car park and disappeared again. Anyway, let's try that again. If you look at this novel in the broader scope of things and look at it as being representative of what was going on in this part of the world at the time, then and you think about the events that are being contained within this novel, then this becomes more of a novel about the people and the world in which they inhabit rather than being about one central character. Indeed, we have seen it with Jacob that he didn't appear for, well, whilst he was referenced, he did not appear for quite a long time in the book. I do think there have been some interesting points of dialogue in here. That could be a bugbear of mine, I suppose, that nobody has one clear, distinctive voice. The clergy have one standard voice regardless of who they are, and when discussions are happening, discussions seem to be happening for the purposes of the novel. Although saying that, I suppose that if we look at Jacob as a character on his own and think about the way in which he speaks, his arrogance and his loftiness is something that I think that only he has. His way of thinking, that matters that he includes within his dialogue, only he does. But it does often feel like, although people can be rather important to the narrative, rather close to Jacob, they don't actually have huge roles. Everybody else feels like a minor character in the path of Jacob's story. It is a novel in which I think you could find a wealth of stuff to discuss. And I don't just mean about the religious aspects, the political aspects. You have the characters. Why did Tokarczuk choose to frame them in the way in which she has framed them within this novel? Morning, Mr. Magpie. Why has she gone to... Why does this novel exist? What is it doing? For me, it's just draws parallels to so much other fiction. I say that if you've read the Karamazov brothers, then you'll get this. The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton blend in some Mantel with the Wolf Hall trilogy. I think that Tokarczuk has done something that authors do all the time with this novel, which is re-examine historical events and present them on the page, but also try and craft some understanding perhaps for herself as an author. I don't know. As I say, I want to know more about this book, how this book came to exist, what influenced the decision to write this tale.
It's been a while since I last updated you, and that's because I've been reading other things. You know, I've been trying to do the Women's Prize reading, and now I'm hoping to finish reading the books of Jacob in the next few days. I have 300 pages left. Not sure what part that means I'm on, but this clearly has not been finished in the time I thought that it would take of reading 100 pages a day. Maybe if I had knuckled down and dedicated some extra time, or just dedicated my time fully to reading this book, then I would have got it done in the time that I originally thought. But at the same time as saying that, I think that had I tried to read this book as 100 pages a day, I would have personally ended up disliking the book more. Well, disliking the book, really, because I actually quite like it. As I've kept saying, when I read it, I'm reminded of so many different books I've read in the past. And currently, we've had a few trials going on in the last 100 pages. And the prose seems to have had a bit of a shift as well. It seems to have found more of a balance between the rather fantastic writerly prose that as a writer I am in awe of, and the more prosaic trials. And in doing this, I'm reminded of the Hilary Mantel Wolf Hall trilogy, because that features so many different trials and so many people having to prove themselves and explain away why they've performed certain actions. These last 100 pages have been some of the best writing in the entire novel, in my opinion. And I rather liked it at one point when they wrote how these people had to find a faith because it's impossible to live in the times they're in without having one. And I'd been thinking that beforehand and thinking about bringing it up as, are these people actually religious? Do they conform to the beliefs that they have? Or are they only trying to find new belief systems because it's impossible to live in that time without finding your people and without just assimilating to their ways of life just so that you can exist? I am hoping to finish it over the next few days. I don't know when. There are only a few, couple of 100 pages left now, but we'll see how the mood takes me. I don't want to rush it and end up disliking the ending, but I don't think that could happen. It's a very long, intense, thought-provoking experience of reading this book, but I am almost glad of that, really. I'm glad to have been challenged by some literature. It can be fun to be challenged by literature when you want to be challenged. Ain't that right, Sal?
You're currently on a men's size 10 brown Wrangler boot. I have cold coffee and the books of Jacob. I brought it to work because I only have 130 pages left. Is that correct? That is correct. 130 pages. Not due to actually start work for another half hour, so I'm going to read for half an hour. I'm going to drink my cold coffee and hopefully make some headway. I mean, that will also tell us how fast I've been reading this, because I do believe I've only been reading 2 pages a minute, and for somebody who usually, 1 page every 2 minutes as opposed to 2 pages every 1 minute like normal. Will say, enjoying the direction that the tale has taken over the last 60 pages, because I was beginning to get very annoyed with our protagonist, who's also an antagonist. I know that there is actually a word for this. I discovered it yesterday, but I can't remember it right now. Anyway, arrived to work and somebody has left a pile of donations in the car park. However, we're going to use this for literary purposes, and we're just going to ignore the fact that it is actual trash. Anyway, books of Jacob. Olga Tokarczuk can write beautifully. She can write a yarn, but bloody hell, she knows how to go on a bit.
A month ago, I believed that I would finish the books of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk, translated by Jennifer Croft, in 9 days. And I thought that because I thought, I'll just read 100 pages today and then just continue to read 100 pages. This coincided with when I was also going to be reading the Women's Prize long list. But I didn't think about that, because I thought, well, 9 days and I'll get into it. I am glad that I didn't read this book in 9 days. Had I read this book in 9 days, then I probably would have seen it as more of a slog and an imposition. To me, the books of Jacob works best when one takes their time over the book, doesn't allow themselves to rush through it. Granted, it would be difficult to rush through. Throughout the reading of this, I have likened it to other books in my mind in terms of historical scope, and taking this historical figure and writing about him in the present tense reminded me very much of Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall trilogy. If we consider the fact that in Wolf Hall we're following, throughout the entire trilogy, we are following the life of Thomas Cromwell, then the Books of Jacob is doing something similar, because we are following Jacob Frank's entire life. His entire life as this pseudo-religious practitioner. It is also interesting to read about and consider it in terms of the Wolf Hall trilogy, because Tokarczuk is doing something that Mantel also did. We are given this gentleman who could perhaps be seen as an antagonist when we consider everything that he did and in terms of where he stood in society. Admittedly, this is a person of which I did not know anything about. So I think that Tokarczuk did a good job at still making the book, and Croft, the translator here as well, have done a good job at creating a yarn that is still accessible, and despite sometimes it turning into a slog to read and can sometimes get bogged down in details, ultimately it has been something of a rewarding experience to read these characters and to consider everything going on within the narrative. There is mysticism in here, and Tokarczuk doesn't shy away from entering into the more metaphysical aspects of religion in order to continue to tell her tale. Very much so, she is aware that what she is doing is fictionalizing an account and various accounts to pull together a story of Jacob Frank. And in doing this, in allowing herself to pull all of these different techniques from fiction and also recognizing that she is fictionalizing a history, she hasn't fallen into the quagmire that other historical fiction writers have done in the past, which is get so stuck on the facts that they don't allow themselves to have any fun or experiment within the prose. Yes, some of the metaphysical, mystical moments were what did it for me and what spoke to that part of my soul that likes the more fantastical elements. But Mantel did that in the Wolf Hall trilogy. What Mantel did in Wolf Hall, Tokarczuk has done here as well, which is recognise that sometimes people's beliefs and things that happen in the world can lend to being able to explore the more ethereal ideas in life. Character-wise, we are spending 892 pages with a character who isn't perhaps the nicest, and we are going to flit about, and it can sometimes feel as though not that certain characters are getting short shrift because we aren't able to fully explore them. Sometimes it does feel as though certain characters are only put in place to be tools to progress the narrative further. However, if we look at creative writing as a whole and when creative writing is being taught, this is something we're taught to do, that characters must have purpose. So it makes sense. I can't say as I felt like I knew the protagonist of this story, because what we have here is a story where it's not necessarily about connecting to any character, it's more about connecting to the narrator and the way in which this narrative, which spans decades, is going to be told. I don't know that this is a book that I would ever reread, but that does not mean that I dislike the book. This is one that I'm glad to have finished, and is one that I have to examine as, did I appreciate everything that was happening in the novel, or does the feeling and the sensation I have now come from this feeling of having achieved something by finishing such a behemoth of a book? And at the moment, I don't know that. Throughout the reading of this, I have been conflicted, because oftentimes I felt as though I haven't really connected. I have felt this disconnect from the writing. I am able to recognise some of the more poetic, beautiful passages of prose that are present within the narrative. However, at the same time, I have felt a bit at an arm's length from the narrative. Throughout the reading of this, I went about it thinking about Sarah of Hardcover Hearts and her reading of Proust's In Search of Lost Time, in which she went very slowly and methodically through the 7 books. And I took it much slower with this book than I have done many books in the past. I likened it to the Karamazov Brothers by Dostoevsky, and unlike that book, I didn't actually end up fizzling out towards the end and just wishing it would end. I found the final 200 pages to perhaps have been the most engaging of the entire novel. Over the 892 pages, we examine various different religions and the different lifestyles and the different countries of the 1700s. And one thing that we kept coming back to was this idea of religion as a means of survival. And I think that that was interesting as somebody who is non-religious to then go and read and think, well, actually, a few hundred years ago, you didn't have any choice if you wanted to have any sort of land or life. And I think that the politics behind religion here and examining of that is interesting to go and look back at and consider the freedoms that we have today, but also the way that nowadays religion can be used to prevent other people from having freedoms. That was interesting to me. The way that Jacob's character changed, and it very much felt as though we were getting this idea of someone living long enough to see themselves become a villain. You know, that quote of dying a hero. It's interesting to consider how he came about his followers as well, and how they stuck by him, the beliefs he had, the weird behaviours that he was associated with. I think that Tokarczuk has done a remarkable job. There's still part of me as a writer that questions whether any book needs to be this long, but as somebody who has read fantasy novels that go over 1,000 pages, I think that we can allow her, when she is writing an entire 2 decades worth of life, to have those 892 pages, when some people can spend 1,000 pages on one singular day. I do think it's brilliant. And whilst I have said I don't know that I would reread it, I think that comes from having just spent a month with this book. Yes, I did read other things alongside it. I think that had I not done that, then I would have very easily tapped out of this novel. I think that a lot of people will DNF this, and I think that some people will decide that it's not worth the slog, because there are some parts of this book that do feel as though you are wading through treacle trying to make your way towards the end. Even though I do say that I wouldn't reread the book, I think that it is a book that bears rereading in order to properly grasp everything that Tokarczuk put into this novel. Part of me questions, and then again this is more of a negative aspect of the book, whether Tokarczuk hadn't researched so much that she included everything in the book rather than removing some of the details. But you know, it is a rather sparse narrative, even though it is 892 pages. It's a very difficult book to think about. I am left with all of these conflicting opinions because beautiful prose, very long book, but it does have a lot to talk about that we could still perhaps look back on and consider in terms of society of today, and how far we've come, or maybe even how far we still have to go in order for everybody to actually get along again. Will anyone ever get along? I don't know. It was interesting to find out more, as I say, about the politics of the day. It was an interesting way to write a novel as well. I don't know that I often get on with this whole omniscient narrator style thing, but as somebody who is a fan of Dickens and has seen that utilised before, it would make sense. I don't know that there's any other way that the story could have been told. It's almost mythological in the way that it works, in that we can never properly know what actually happened. But I think that Tokarczuk has done a rather splendid job of creating a fictionalised account and a pretty strong narrative. After certain events, when we still had 60 pages left of the book, I did wonder what was going to happen, whether this book was going to fizzle out. And I began to question this final part of the book. But when I reached the end of the novel, I couldn't help but think that Tokarczuk had really given this book the ending that it needed and had put the time in to craft a fully realised narrative. I've seen people call this a masterpiece, and I understand why they have done that. It definitely uses some very classic storytelling techniques, and I think that I would still say to people that if they are wary of reading this book but would like to do so, if you've ever read a piece of classic fiction, I'm talking Victorian literature here, that goes all around the houses, then you will be okay with this one. If you've read The Eighth Life by Nino Harachvili, that's perhaps got more of an accessible tone than this book, but I think that you can still read this book. I think that there's nothing in this book, apart from its length, that is going to cause people to avoid it. But do what I did maybe, go slowly, take your time with it, and it can be a bit mind-boggling at times. Characters' names are going to change, and you're going to wonder who people are, what they're doing, and who they are in relation to everything that's going on. But somehow it works, and when you've finished it, you are going to feel like you've accomplished something. I have to say that after 892 pages, when I consider other books that I have read over the last month or so, this is one of the only ones that hasn't left me disappointed. It's left me questioning things. It's left me thinking about society at the time in which this novel is set. And I have learnt about a parcel of the world that I didn't previously know about. It can be visual, it can be mystical, and it can be philosophical, and whilst the characters might not be the most well drawn, this is more a tale of a world in flux, a change in time, and also manages to reflect on society of today. And I think that it's definitely worth the time spent on it. So there we go. That is The Books of Jacob or Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk, translated by Jennifer Croft. And it is a little bit marvellous. If you've read this book and would like to discuss it, then please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope that you have enjoyed this video. And until next time, that is all.